I now take you back to the very earliest history of Islam, back to the time of Muhammad. And the focus of this course, is on the modern period, which modern as from a historian's perspective, actually covering a few hundred years in the case of the Middle East. But before we get to that, we really need to have some basic background about developments during the quote unquote pre-modern period. Having said that, the next series of lectures, and we're going to try and give the short version of that history, but we're covering a lot of time, so it's going to take a little bit of time to get through the material that we need to cover with regard to the pre-modern period. Of course, we begin with the Arabian Peninsula, and the map that we see here is a kind of present-day map with modern-day borders and so forth. Again, reminding you that the term Saudi referring to the ruling dynasty today, so back in the day it would have simply been Arabia. And when we think of Arabia, whether today or at the time of Muhammad, we tend to think of this kind of environment as a very desert-like kind of environment. What you see here actually is one region of Arabia, what's known as the Empty Quarter, Ruba Khali. Today, the Arabian Desert, and that's about the size of France. So there definitely are parts of the Middle East that look like this, and I mean they are virtually uninhabitable. Even scorpions would have a hard time making a go of it in this kind of environment. But not all of the Arabian Desert, or if we were talking about the Saharan Desert in North Africa, you have parts of it that look more like this, right? So I mean, very dry, arid environment. But there are enough resources, enough kind of living material that you might be able to eke out a basic existence. Of course, this kind of environment isn't going to support a very large population, and in most cases, not really going to support settlement, right? So again, if we're going back to the time of Muhammad, the vast majority of the inhabitants of Arabia were nomadic, more specifically known as Bedouin, right? So meaning that they move around from place to place. They don't have permanent settlements. Usually they do have herds of, in this case, either camels or sheep. The term we use in this case would be pastoralist. And so they move from one place to another looking for forage for their animals, right? And so it's a very nomadic kind of existence. And again, this is something you would have found not just in the Arabian Desert, but throughout much of North Africa, kind of desert belt running from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Arabian Peninsula, right? The Sahara to the Arabian Desert. So you don't have a lot of Bedouin today, by the way. There are still some, but modern states tend not to like nomadic people. They tend to be difficult with respect to, getting them to pay taxes, respecting borders, respecting private property rights, and so forth. So very often policies are geared towards forcibly settling them down. But there still are some, and the image you see here is a modern-day Bedouin. We should probably describe a bit what Bedouin life was like. Very often, very much organized around a kind of tribal structure. Tribes very often breaking down into smaller groups known as clans. You don't really have much in terms of a political hierarchy. You might have some sheikhs who have some measure of authority. The term sheikh, by the way, in Arabic, literally meaning respected older gentleman might be a term. Venerated individual, right? And so, whatever leadership authority they had was very often kind of conferred upon them simply by virtue of their being highly respected, right? I mean, it wasn't a very formal kind of political authority. So overall, very kind of egalitarian social structure. But the clan and extending that further to the tribe is sacrosanct, right? There is a tremendous sense of obligation to look out for fellow clansmen or tribesmen. In particular, if one of them is harmed, there is a kind of strong sense of honor attached to the idea that they must be avenged, right? So if somebody in your clan was killed, ideally you would hunt down the individual responsible, but it might even be considered sufficient to kill someone else belonging to that individual's clan. Of course, that kind of relationship can lead to That kind of structure can lead to blood feuds. But fortunately, in an area like the Arabian Peninsula, clans and tribes would actually not frequently encounter one another. So even though there would be kind of a sense that one had an obligation to avenge someone who was killed in your clan, you might actually be able to avoid for a long period of time having to carry that out. Nonetheless, right, that is one thing we really can't underestimate, this kind of code of honor attached to the need to look out for fellow clansmen, to have their back, right? And that also would, of course, act as a restraint before perhaps arbitrarily killing someone belonging to another clan. We should finally note the broader political environment at the time of Muhammad. Arabian desert kind of sandwiched between two great empires. On this map in green, on the one hand, the Byzantine Empire, what remained of the once great Roman Empire, its capital located in Constantinople, which you can't see here on the map. It would be kind of off to the northwest. And then the other great empire, the Sassanid Empire, more or less corresponding to modern-day Iran. Both had state religions. This is actually highly relevant, but they functioned somewhat differently in each case. So in the Byzantine Empire, the state religion was Christian Orthodoxy, more or less corresponding to what today we call Greek Orthodoxy. And in the case of the Byzantine Empire, you pretty much were expected to ascribe to the state faith, meaning not simply that you were Christian, but that you were the right kind of Christian. So certainly Jews were heavily persecuted and not particularly welcome. But you had large numbers of Christians who were perceived as being heretical, meaning perceived as having wrong belief. Very important in this regard would be the Coptic Christians based in Egypt, which we briefly noted when we looked at kind of the religious demographics of the region. And so they were very often heavily persecuted. We don't need to get into the details of it, but they had slightly different beliefs regarding the nature of Christ. This is going to prove very relevant down the road when you have invading Muslim armies. They're actually going to welcome them with open arms because they really have a dim view of Byzantine authority. So, kind of nothing to lose, really, by bringing in a new authority. In the case of the Sassanid Empire, the state religion is Zoroastrianism, which we also looked at briefly. Very few of them left today. I think we did mention that it's not a evangelizing faith. There's kind of very little attempt to kind of spread the religion. And this was true back at the time of the Sassanid Empire. It's really perceived as a religion belonging to the political elite. So related to that, they were very tolerant of other religions, and you had large numbers of Christians. Many of them, these so-called heretical Christians escaping from the Byzantine Empire, but also large numbers of Jews. On the other hand, the subject population, partly by virtue of not having a shared faith, didn't feel a strong sense of attachment to the political elite, and that will be a factor later on when confronted with invading Muslim armies, where the subject population are really, the best term might be to say they were somewhat indifferent about what happened to the ruling Zoroastrian elite. One last thing I should note, Byzantine and Sassanid empires very often in conflict with one another, and very often various Arab tribes siding with the one or the other, often in a kind of mercenary capacity, related to which you do have some Arab tribes that are either Christian or Jewish. Having said that, the vast majority of Arabs are pagan. This is, again, we're looking at the time right about when Muhammad arrived on the scene. Pagan in the sense that they worshipped various deities who represented the different forces of nature. Regarding which, we should probably note that while the vast majority of Arabs were nomadic, Bedouin, you do have a number of settlements that by the time of Muhammad had emerged on the Arabian Peninsula, often centered around oases, which, contrary to the popular image, where it seems to be like a little pond with a few palm trees. Maybe I'm thinking of Bugs Bunny cartoons here or something, but they actually could be quite sizable. Enough water kind of percolating up from under the ground to sustain a large town or even eventually a city, right? So, I mean, kind of covering hundreds of acres. And in this case, one particular oasis town that became very important, it became very prominent in connection with trade and pilgrimage, was Mecca, which you can see on the map there. So Mecca was located on the caravan route coming up from the southern part of Arabia, shipping coming from across the Indian Ocean from India, and then kind of making its way up to the Mediterranean. Right, so Mecca became a very important center of trade in connection with the caravan route, but it also became a very important center of pilgrimage in connection with its central shrine, the Kaaba, which we already discussed is centrality within Islam with respect to the Hajj. But during the pre-Islamic period, it was considered as having housed up to 360 idols representing various gods and goddesses that the different Arab tribes worshipped. So, a center of trade and pilgrimage, and what's really important is how these two things became interlinked. As a center of pilgrimage, the area around the Kaaba was considered to be sacred. The term they use is haram. And so the idea is that when you entered this kind of sacred precinct around the Kaaba, you were not allowed to engage in violence. Now, if you think about it, this becomes very important with respect to kind of ongoing blood feuds. If you showed up there, you pretty much had to check your sword at the door. But on the other hand, you felt pretty safe. You didn't have to worry about if you ran into somebody with whom you had a blood feud. It's a little bit like in the old Westerns when, one of the towns, they have a party, they ask gunmen to, gunslingers to please check their gun at the door, right? You kind of have to, temporarily put aside any kind of blood feud or hostilities you had with someone else. And this became very, very important with respect to trade. You came for the pilgrimage and you would engage in trade while you're there, feeling pretty secure. And eventually trade really grew in connection with the pilgrimage, and Mecca became very wealthy. Now, very important, we should also note, is that one particular tribe came to dominate Mecca, and that was the Quraysh tribe. From whence Muhammad came, right? So Quraysh tribe later on will also be considered important because of his connection to Muhammad. And within Mecca, one clan in particular, one clan of the Quraysh tribe became very, very dominant politically and in terms of wealth, and that was the Umayyad clan. And so before we proceed any further, just to kind of set the stage, imagine for a second that you're a member of the Umayyad clan, a very wealthy merchant living in Mecca, right? And from your perception, your wealth is very much tied to this relationship between trade and pilgrimage in connection with pagan worship. So how are you going to feel if somebody shows up with the message that we need to get rid of the pagan worship, right? Probably you're thinking this isn't going to be good for business. Which brings us to Muhammad, exactly the individual with that message that really nobody in Mecca wanted to hear, right? So before we proceed any further, just to kind of identify a few key figures in the early history of Islam in connection with Muhammad. So of course, Muhammad, born in 570, to a relatively weak clan, the Hashemite clan of the Quraysh tribe. And further weakening his position is the fact that by the age of 6, he has become orphaned. Both his parents have died, which within this kind of tribal structure, kind of disassociates you with the clan. Fortunately for him, he's adopted by his uncle, Abu Talib, also of the Hashemite clan, who, again, is a relatively weak clan, but Abu Talib is actually a pretty important figure in Mecca. And that becomes relevant later on, right? Because even if people start to take issue with Muhammad, maybe not happy about the message he's conveying, you really would hesitate to go after him in any kind of physical way because you would run the risk of having a blood feud with Abu Talib, who is actually a pretty powerful figure in Mecca. At some point, Muhammad will marry. His first wife is Khadija. And during her life, he will never take another wife. I think many people are familiar with the fact that within Islam, you are permitted up to 4 wives. First of all, let me point out that, it's one thing to say that you're permitted to do something, it's another whether large numbers of people actually do that. Vast majority of Muslims do not take multiple wives today. And by the way, before Islam, you were within Arab society, you were actually permitted to take even more than 4 wives. And I should finally point out, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but in large measure, that really related to the fact that large numbers of men might be killed, either in connection with blood feuds or when engaging in raids, which was considered a legitimate activity within Arabian tribal society. So it was kind of an idea in order to ensure that a widowed woman was still kind of, protected by the clan. If her husband was killed, it might be considered obligatory in a sense that the brother should marry the widow, right? Just to kind of keep her within the clan. It wasn't, the idea wasn't that, when a man became tired of his wife, he just took another one. Of course, men being men, very often, as you might imagine, they might abuse that stipulation, but in any event, it's a bit more of a complicated phenomena than most people realize. And while Muhammad himself would later take on multiple wives, very often for political reasons in order to form tribal alliances, kind of how in medieval Europe kings would often marry, kings and queens would marry more in order to create alliances between royal families. While Khadija was alive, he would never take another wife. And in fact, it's generally perceived that he had a very, very close relationship with her. She became a very important source of moral support after he became a prophet, which he did not do, by the way, until he was 40 years old. 2 other individuals I would just highlight right now. Muhammad's cousin Ali, the son of his uncle Abu Talib, with whom he became very close and who later on would be an early convert to the new faith. And finally, Muhammad's best friend Abu Bakr, who also was an early convert to Islam. Now, regarding Muhammad, well, we already mentioned that Muhammad was orphaned at a pretty early age, that he married his first wife Khadija during her lifetime, never took another wife. He really doesn't become a prophet until much later in life, around the age of 40. Though, according to Islamic tradition, from an early point, highly respected individual, considered to be extremely fair, just, wise. He was a successful merchant and actually initially had started out working for his wife Khadija before he became her husband and partner, if you will. But eventually, of course, yes, he becomes a prophet. And you might be, kind of noting the 2 images here. So before we proceed further, I should note, there's kind of the idea in Islam that it's not really encouraged, or in some cases it's even been actively discouraged, that he should be, he should be depicted facially or even in bodily form, right? So on the one hand, to the right, we see an image of him next to the Kaaba where he has a veil in front of his face. Right, and then to the left, we have him being depicted by his name, a kind of, beautiful rendering of his name in Arabic script. And the basic reason for this is that they really want to ensure that Muslims never, feel somehow encouraged to worship Muhammad as opposed to God. Right, so, for instance, in Islam, much as in Judaism, right, there's a tendency to really, kind of frown upon the depiction of Jesus within Catholicism as, something that might encourage Christians to worship, from their perspective, false idols, right? So, having said that, you do actually find historically depictions, artistic depictions of Muhammad where, you see his body or even his face, but it is something that does tend to be discouraged. Right? So, one last thing before we proceed any further. Much of what I'm relating now really comes out of Islamic tradition. That doesn't mean that it's not true, but we don't really have any non-Islamic sources about the situation in Mecca at the time of Muhammad or the early life of Muhammad, right? Which from a historian's point of view, would be great. It'd be kind of that smoking gun that really confirms what we already got from the Islamic tradition. It could be, for instance, kind of a traveler visiting Mecca, leaving some kind of record of what he experienced there and so forth. We don't have anything like that. By the way, same problem when we're dealing with the early life of Jesus. We have literally no non-Christian sources about Jesus. Some of you might be thinking, well, what about Josephus? No, we do have non-Christian sources that there were people who followed someone called Christ, maybe 30, 40, 50 years down the road after Jesus had died, but we don't have anything contemporaneous with the life of Jesus, right? In both cases, that doesn't mean, either that the Islamic or biblical sources are somehow wrong, right? But again, a historian would be quite happy to have, other kind of, shall we say, non-interested sources to confirm what we're reading in the religious texts, right? So just, wanted to kind of preface our discussion with a little bit of kind of historical background in that vein. So, again, Muhammad not a prophet for much of his life until the year 610, so around the age of 40, during the Arabic month of Ramadan. There's an interesting month. Muhammad receives a visit from the angel Gabriel. So, according to the Islamic tradition, Muhammad had taken up the habit of periodically going off into the desert and meditating in a nearby cave, a cave nearby to Mecca. And during one such meditation, he was visited by the angel Gabriel, which, by the way, some of you familiar with the Christian Bible might be thinking, well, that's a rather familiar name. I think we briefly mentioned this, but many of the stories that we find in the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, or i.e. the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible, are going to make their way into Islam. And we'll see references to these individuals in many parts of the Quran. And here we see Gabriel, much as he was a messenger angel conveying to the Virgin Mary that she was going to give birth to Jesus, here conveying the word of God to Muhammad. And so the essential message to Muhammad was that he had been appointed the messenger of God, and the message was pretty simple. There is only one God, Allah, and the Arabs are to submit to God's will. I think we mentioned earlier that the actual literal translation of Quran is recitation, and that is how Gabriel began his message to Muhammad, by commanding him to recite. And so, as we talked about very briefly before, when Muhammad shows up in Mecca with this message, it's not going to be well received, right? It's very quickly perceived as kind of a threat to their way of life, to the source of their wealth. I should note Muhammad at first is even doubtful about his own experience. He goes to his wife Khadija. He's like, I think I've lost my mind. She actually talks to a Christian member of her family to get some advice. He's like, no, this sounds like the real deal. And she becomes a very important source of moral support. But beyond some early converts like his cousin Ali and his best friend Abu Bakr, it's going to be some time before he makes any serious headway. And in fact, initially the Umayyad clan in particular, not happy about the message, but they're like, you know what, really ashamed what happened to Muhammad, seemed like such a, upstanding guy. But he doesn't really seem to present much of a threat, right? His message isn't really resonating with people. Best thing is to ignore him. But over time, more and more people are going to be drawn to his message of monotheism, right? Kind of rejection of pagan worship in favor of the worship of the one true God, Allah. And at some point, he will be perceived as a threat by the Umayyad clan in Mecca. But again, as long as his uncle Abu Talib is around, there's not really a lot they can do about it. But then in the year 619, both Abu Talib and Khadija die. And that means that Muhammad is now very vulnerable, right? I mean, in terms of enjoying some kind of protection because of the danger of starting a blood feud. In fact, many of his followers, who we might refer to as Muslims, those who have submitted to the will of God, have already been persecuted. According to Islamic traditions, some of them had even temporarily fled to Ethiopia, which was a Christian kingdom, where they were granted sanctuary as fellow monotheists. But now Muhammad himself is in danger. And it becomes very quickly apparent that Muhammad and his followers need to get out of Mecca. But the question becomes, where should they go to? Quite fortunate then that around this time a delegation arrived from a nearby, relatively nearby, about 200 miles away to the north, oasis town of Yathrib, today known as Medina. Medina meaning city, as in this case, city of the prophet, but not yet. So this delegation was running into a problem. This kind of reflected the problem of tribes recently settling down in very close proximity, where perhaps they had some outstanding blood feuds that they hadn't really dealt with until now, and so it was kind of threatening to pull things apart a bit in Yathrib. And I didn't mention there is one way to kind of get around violence in a blood feud, which is if both parties agree to third-party arbitration. Somebody that is perceived as being wise and fair. And that both parties are willing to accept whatever ruling they come up with and abide by it. And so this delegation had shown up hoping that Muhammad, whom they had heard some things about, could fulfill that role. And Muhammad was like, okay, I'm quite happy to do that, but in return, you must grant me and my followers, the Muslim community, sanctuary in your city. And this was agreed to, and will lead to what is the seminal event, the most important event in the history of Islam, the Hijrah. And so I want to think carefully about why is this event considered so important. This will actually mark the beginning of the Islamic calendar. It begins with this event, which on the Christian calendar takes place in the year 622. And I will expect you to remember this year. I mean, this is a very, very important year in the history of Islam. Hijrah, literally the Arabic word for migration, referring to the emigration of Muhammad and his followers to the city of Yathrib. Let's just say Medina, because that's how we know it today, in the year 622. But why is this event considered so significant? I mean, really, there is no better way to mark the importance of an event to initiate a whole new calendar with it, right? So you might be wondering, why not the year 619, when Muhammad experienced his first prophecy, or the birthday of Muhammad? So most important here is that with this migration, right, with the relocating of Muhammad and his followers to Medina, they have finally severed all ties with the Quraysh, with whatever clan they had belonged to. Right? I mean, up until now, when you became a Muslim, it was kind of considered that your primary loyalty was to your fellow Muslim, regardless of any other ties you had until then, or any other kind of relationship that might have existed between your clan and another. But as long as you were in Mecca, you would kind of feel pulled in both directions, right? I mean, you had kind of dual loyalty. With this decision, right, to relocate, this really does kind of mark a complete break with the old tribal order, and you now fully belong to the community of believers, what's known as the Ummah. Easy way to remember that term. I always think of the actress Uma Thurman, though I'm not sure she's as famous now as she used to be. But that is a very important term, right? In theory, it's kind of like a supra-tribe, if you will. And all that matters is that you are fellow believers. Having said that, in reality, tribal and clan ties are going to continue to matter well up until, I'd say, the 19th century. They, even some relevancy today, though not that important. But at least in theory, they shouldn't matter anymore. And having moved to Medina, you're kind of initiating the start of this new concept of community, related to which Muhammad is now not only a religious leader, i.e. prophet, he is also the political leader of this new community. and very soon will also demonstrate that he is a very, very effective military leader. So, okay, so the Muslims have now migrated to Yathrib, i.e. Medina, which is primarily an agricultural community. And so Muhammad and the Muslims are coming from, kind of a trading background. They're not really making a tremendous impression on the locals, shall we say. I mean, they don't seem particularly useful, don't really know a shovel from a hoe. So they're kind of under pressure to demonstrate their value. Particularly Muhammad at some point is kind of asserting his leadership over all of Yathrib through negotiations. This is all done very peacefully. So at some point, Muhammad and the Muslims take up to raiding the caravan trade headed to Mecca or heading out of Mecca, right? And so a number of things here, right? First of all, and I mentioned it briefly, raiding within, historically within Arabian tribal society was considered not just acceptable, but if you were effective at it, even something kind of, that would earn you prestige. And Muhammad proves very successful. And this is going to actually encourage not just the Arabs living in Medina, but also in the Arabian Peninsula as a whole to rally behind him. And eventually this is going to bring him into military confrontation with the Meccans, who feel they have to do something about this. And the Muslims are going to do very well in that regard as well. The first battle, in fact, they're greatly outnumbered by the Meccans, and they nonetheless prevail. And from that point forward, pretty much successful in every military encounter they have with the Meccans. So a lot of Arabs are going to kind of rally to Muhammad's flag, which does mean converting to the new faith. Some of them perhaps, doing this, with a great deal of sincerity. I mean, they really kind of buy into the religious message. Others probably more attracted to Muhammad as an effective political and military leader. But these two things are interconnected. There is kind of this growing perception that maybe Muhammad does enjoy the favor of God. I mean, look at what's happening here. And so eventually he's going to be able to unite much of the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula, initially against the Meccans, but eventually bringing them into the fold as well. Now, before we get to that, I do want to say a few words about an incident that takes place in Yathrib. It's actually not one incident, but a series of incidents involving the three Jewish tribes in Yathrib or Medina. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, particularly if you're looking in the internet, you'll very often find something, kind of using these episodes, which are accounted for in the Quran, as evidence that Muslims have always hated Jews, that, this is kind of underlying the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis and so forth. And there really just isn't much truth to this. So first of all, the passages you find in the Quran are referring to these very specific Jewish tribes, not to Jews in general, who had kind of a falling out with Muhammad and the early Muslim community. There are many other passages in the Quran talking about the Jews in their entirety, and generally speaking very favorably about them and Christians as fellow monotheists. But if you're not familiar with that, if you're reading the passage, particularly if it's taken out of context, it could be very misleading. Second of all, let me point out that historically we have very little evidence of conflict between Jews and Muslims until we get to the late 19th century and the beginnings of Israel. And I would argue that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, or between Israel and the Arabs, if you want to put it that way, is more about nationalism and reflects more modern day political considerations, right? But I did want to say something about what happened, so it doesn't seem like I'm just trying to ignore this. So the three Jewish tribes in Medina or Yathrib. First of all, Muhammad did kind of hope they would accept him as a prophet, but they didn't. So kind of getting off onto the wrong, on the wrong foot with that. The second thing is these Jewish tribes, these weren't like some kind of ghettoized Jewish community as we might find in medieval Europe. They were very powerful tribes that simply happened to be Jewish. And on a number of occasions, particularly when the Muslims were in conflict with the Meccans, it did appear that their loyalty to the Muslims was questionable. They had kind of agreed to accept Muhammad as the other members of Yathrib had, as the leaders of Medina. But whenever they came into conflict with the Meccans, it wasn't entirely clear whose side they were on. So this happened a number of times. The first two times, one of the Jewish tribes ended up being exiled. The third time, all its men were killed and its women and children sold into slavery. Let's just say by, three strikes you're out. By the third time, Muhammad was under, tremendous pressure to demonstrate that he was, willing to make the hard decision with a group of people who had not once, not twice, but three times had actually, to all indications, betrayed the Muslim community, right? And within tribal Arabian society, this kind of, you would actually say he was pretty merciful, that it took him this long to actually punish any of the Jewish tribes to this extent, right? But nonetheless, right, the passages in the Quran relating these episodes, very often taken out of context, and I just wanted to make sure that we actually touched on them. In case you run into something like this, and you'll be better prepared to know how to interpret them. So coming back to the broader narrative and making a long story short, to the extent that Muhammad proves himself a formidable political military leader, he is able to rally the various tribes of Arabia, and by his death in 632, a mere 10 years after the Hijrah, he had united the Arab tribes of Arabia under the banner of Islam. The last to fall were the Umayyads within Mecca. He eventually marched on Mecca, at which point the Umayyad clan were compelled to accept Islam. And it should be noted, he was very generous with how he treated them, considering all the trouble he had given them. There were a few individuals that, they just gone a little too far. But for the most part, they were brought into the fold of Islam. And there was no retribution. And it's at this point also that the Kaaba is transformed into a center of Islamic worship. And according to Islamic tradition, this is what it was originally created for. The fact that it had become a center of pagan worship reflected its corruption over the centuries. So Muhammad dies in 632. That's actually, only had just managed to unite Arabia. Well, that's going to raise some pretty big questions, particularly about the leadership of the community. And, it's a very young community. And so it's really initially going to be by kind of a consultation among the more important members of the early Muslim community. And the term they come up with for the leader of the Muslim community is caliph, literally meaning successor. The first one will be his best friend, one of the earliest converts, Abu Bakr. He's the first of what are often referred to as the four righteously guided caliphs, or Khulafa Rashidin. The term rightly guided, I should note, not meaning that they were somehow perfect, but more reflecting the fact that they had all known Muhammad personally. So after Muhammad's death, the first problem is going to be that a significant number of the Arab tribes are going to decide, well, that was fun, Muhammad was great. It was great while it lasted, but it's over. And so some of them are going to leave the Muslim community or the Ummah. And so the first order of business for Abu Bakr is going to be bringing these individuals back in the fold. These, shall we say, apostate tribes. And this is going to lead to what's known as the Ridda Wars, a reference to their, the idea that they had committed apostasy, had broken with the faith. And for the most part, he's able to negotiate most of them back into the fold. There's some combat, but it goes pretty smoothly. And eventually he's able to reunite the Arab tribes under the banner of Islam. But he does realize that, within tribal society, there's a lot of, shall we say, combative energy. Arabia's been united. He needs to give them something to do. He's going to direct the tribe's combative energies northward. And this is going to mark the beginning of the creation of a vast empire. Now, Abu Bakr only lives for 2 years past Muhammad's death. He will be succeeded by another close companion of the Prophet, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who I like to call the Clint Eastwood of the four rightly guided caliphs, in the sense that he was tough, but he was fair, but you definitely did not mess with him. And pretty much it's just going to be a continuation of the policies initiated under Abu Bakr. Of Muslim expansion, conquering very rapidly most of what today we consider to constitute the Middle East. We already talked about how in Egypt they're going to be welcomed with open arms by the Coptic Christians there, considered heretical by the Byzantines and therefore often persecuted, so why not try something new? Jews certainly throughout these territories quite happy to exchange Byzantine rule for Muslim rule. The Sassanid Empire is going to crumble like the proverbial house of cards, mostly because, as we talked about, there was really little commitment to the ruling elite by the subject population there. And the empire will continue to expand after that. Within the roughly the space of 100 years, creating this empire that's going to go all the way to the west to Spain, and including Spain, and then to the east to the borders of China. And, it's really interesting to think about. If you would ask somebody, say in Damascus around the time Muhammad was born, where do you think the next great empire is going to come from? And you had responded, oh, I think it'll come from the deserts of Arabia. They would have looked at you like you pretty much lost your mind. So after Umar, the next caliph will be Uthman. And we're not going to get in too much detail about kind of the early politics, but the long and short of it is Uthman proves to be very unpopular, in large measure because he tends to favor members of his own clan, the Umayyad clan, for important positions in the new government that they're creating to manage this empire. And so eventually he's assassinated. And then after him, the fourth caliph is going to be Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. He had married Muhammad's daughter Fatima, Ali. And we already talked about Ali, one of the earliest converts to Islam, the son of his uncle Abu Talib. Hence, Ali ibn means son of Abu Talib. And so he will be the fourth caliph. And we should note at this point, there were some in the early Muslim community who felt that he should have been the immediate successor to Muhammad because of his special relationship to Muhammad. And so already a kind of idea was developing that there is something about the bloodline, the fact that he's actually related to Muhammad, and then his children, of course, would be the grandsons of Muhammad. Muhammad had no surviving sons of his own, so closest thing to a son. They felt this would have given him a kind of special ability in terms of understanding Muhammad's will, God's will, how best to understand the Quran, and so forth. Right? So, I mean, these ideas are still kind of formulating at this point, but this will become the foundation for an important division within Islam into the two major sects that we have today, Sunnism and Shiism. So the third caliph, Uthman, had been assassinated, and one of the individuals he had appointed from his clan, from the Umayyad clan, was his cousin Muawiyah as the governor of Damascus. And, remember, under the old tribal system, and, old habits die hard, Muawiyah feels a tremendous responsibility to avenge the death of his cousin Uthman. And so he basically indicates to Ali that he will only recognize him as the caliph if he turns over those individuals he deems responsible for the assassination of his cousin. And these are, in fact, some of the most important supporters of Ali, and so therefore Ali is obviously very reluctant to do that. Would also come across as, kind of a sign of weakness. And so eventually there's going to be a battle between the two of them. This takes place at a place called Siffin, not far from Damascus. And initially Ali is actually winning. And at some point an advisor goes to Muawiyah and suggests that he has his men put pages of the Quran on the tips of their spears, hold them aloft, kind of a waving of the white flag, appealing for a peaceful arbitration, right? A kind of negotiated settlement. And Ali agrees to do this. Now, many of his followers are actually quite upset by this. They many of them feel that it's God's will that he should be caliph, and therefore, he was also actually winning. So why would he be, willing to actually negotiate with this upstart? But, if we look at it from Ali's point of view, probably, not feeling that this is a very auspicious way to begin his caliphate with, Muslims killing one another. But in any event, many of his followers were quite upset. And so they started to drift away from him. Some of them actually went on to form a completely new sect of Islam, no longer with us, known as the Kharijites, where they kind of promoted the idea that the leadership should fall to the best Muslim. And eventually one of them assassinates Ali. In the meantime, Muawiyah is able to negotiate with various tribal chiefs and important individuals and bring them over to his side, and eventually establishes the first of two what we call high caliphates, the Umayyad Caliphate. So the Umayyad Caliphate, or you could say Umayyad Empire, will last until 750 CE. So effectively established by Muawiyah. And the basic idea here is that the caliphate has now been converted into a dynasty, right? The idea that each successive caliph is the son or nearest male heir to the preceding one. And we should note that this kind of dynastic principle is something heavily frowned upon in Islam. So there are many Muslims who aren't too happy with this development. Historically, there's a tendency to look back and view the Umayyads in a very negative light, though some historians would suggest that it wasn't, so black and white as often portrayed. But definitely there were many who were not happy with this development. And so eventually they are going to rally behind an individual who they feel might be able to overthrow the Umayyads and establish a just Islamic empire. And so already the idea is beginning to really take hold, to take root, that Ali and his descendants were the rightful rulers of the Islamic realm, right? So many who are not happy with Umayyad rule, they begin to rally around the descendants of Ali. And this idea really begins to take hold that, if only the caliphate had remained in the family of Muhammad, everything would have been perfect. And so at some point, the focus is going to be on one of Ali's sons, who, by the way, is also a grandson of the Prophet of Muhammad, Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. Hussein is quite sufficient in this case. For the most part, if you're talking about early Islamic history and you just say the name Hussein, everyone knows who you're talking about. And so people rally to him as someone who might overthrow Umayyad rule. And promises are made that if he could march up to the city of Kufa, at this point more what we call a garrison town that had been established to house the Arab armies located in present-day Iraq, that there are large numbers of Arabs there who would support him, who've promised him their allegiance, right? So at some point, Hussein sets off from Mecca with a small number of followers, about 70 individuals, headed for Kufa, where he's counting on their support to then challenge Umayyad rule. And by the way, at this point, the seat of government in the Umayyad Empire is now in Damascus. Unfortunately for Hussein, word gets back to Damascus, to the Umayyads there, regarding this expedition, shall we say. And before Hussein and his followers can get to Kufa, they're intercepted at a place called Karbala, which you can see marked there on a map of modern-day Iraq. This takes place in 680. So it ends up being kind of a Umayyad army of over 1,000 versus Hussein and his roughly 70 followers. You can pretty much anticipate the outcome. And from a strictly military point of view, not much more than a minor skirmish. Hussein and his followers are all killed. Hussein is beheaded. His head is sent back to Damascus as proof of the deed. And the Umayyads just carry on with their rule. But this becomes a defining event within Shiism. Right, the martyrdom of Hussein, particularly relevant in this regard, is that his supporters in Kufa never showed up. They basically disappeared into the woodwork, as they say, and left him to his fate. And so this becomes kind of an event. The battle is actually commemorated every year during the month of Muharram by Shiites. And obviously it's not a happy occasion. It's more one of regret. And it's funny. It's never presented as, it's really unfortunate that back then his supporters didn't show up. It's always presented as something happening in the present, right? That we today failed Hussein in his hour of need when he was standing up to Umayyad oppression and tyranny, and we should be prepared to become martyrs ourselves, if necessary, doing the same. It might be with respect to present-day leaders. And by the way, this will become a very important factor when we look at the Iranian Revolution. I won't get into it too much now, but it does become kind of a defining event in this emerging schism between Sunnis and Shiites, right? So we're going to learn more about both sects. Sunnis, of course, make up the vast majority of Muslims in the world today, roughly 90%. The term Sunni or Sunnism comes from the word sunnah, which corresponds to the behavioral practice of the Prophet, which becomes a model for how one should live their life as a good Muslim. Hence why Sunnis often known as Ahl al-Sunnah, right? The followers of the house of the practice of the Prophet. And we're not going to get into it too much, but in some way Sunnism develops in reaction to Shiism, right? Kind of rejecting the idea that the leadership somehow should have belonged to the descendants of Ali and that somehow the bloodline should matter in this regard, right? So, Shiites, on the other hand, again, the term coming from Shi'at Ali or partisans of Ali, the idea that you are a follower of Ali and his descendants, and that they would have had, ideas developed that they would have had perfect knowledge of Islam, of the Quran, of God's will, and so forth, and therefore you would basically follow their direction, right? So Sunnis rejecting that idea and saying, well, okay, if we don't follow Ali and his descendants, then, how do we know how to behave as good Muslims? And they look rather to traditions that develop about things that Muhammad said and did, known as hadith, that can provide a model for how to live as good Muslims. So the Shiites, again, believing that the leadership of the Muslim community or Ummah should have belonged to these individuals descended from Muhammad through the line of Ali. And the term they use for these so-called legitimate rulers of Islam is imam, right? If we're talking about in terms of an institution, the imamate. And these are, again, the legitimate rulers of Islam, as opposed to the Umayyad and then later the Abbasid caliphs, the individuals who actually hold real power, which, by the way, brings us to another important point, that the imams never actually hold real power, or almost never, which makes it easier to believe that things would have been perfect if only the leadership had fallen to them. Right? So again, this idea that it is a direct line of descent through Ali coming from the Prophet Muhammad. Ali being the first Imam, Hussein the second Imam, and so on down the line. And by the way, I do want to mention that the term Imam is also used among Sunnis, but it has a, shall we say, a much smaller meaning, only referring to prayer leaders in the mosque. So, if you're talking to a Sunni Muslim versus a Shiite Muslim and they use the term imam, obviously probably has a much different meaning. Now, within Shiism, you're actually going to see the emergence of three different sects, and this has to do with the line of descent. And kind of differences of opinions about who the successor should have been in a particular generation. So we have on the one hand the Zaydis, known as Fivers, because they diverge from the mainstream with the fifth generation. The Ismailis, known as Seveners, because they diverge with the seventh generation. And the Jafaris, or Twelvers, and they constitute the vast majority of Shiites. And the reason they're called Twelvers is because for them, the line of descent ended with the 12th Imam. Right? So I put this chart up here that kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about. You'll see that when you get to the fifth generation, most Shiites felt that the next Imam should have been Muhammad al-Baqir, but there were some who felt it should have been his brother Zayd, hence the term Zaydis, Fivers, so they kind of split off from the mainstream with the fifth generation. And for them, the line of Imams would continue right down until the present. Ismailis, same basic idea with the seventh generation. Most Shiites felt it should have been Musa al-Kazim, but there were some who felt it should have been his brother Ismail, and so those individuals came to be known as Seveners or Ismailis. Historically, Ismailis in some ways going to play a much more prominent role. They would found a number of dynasties. Probably the most important would be the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, taking its name from the daughter of Muhammad, and again the idea that the line of Imams were descended from Muhammad through the line of Ali and his wife Fatima. They would also constitute a revolutionary movement around the time of the Crusades, known as assassins. So they were this kind of secretive political movement that went around killing Muslim political leaders, Sunni leaders who they disapproved of, basically just trying to be disruptive, if you will. And interestingly enough, the word assassin in English comes from a practice associated with these individuals. Apparently, and it's not entirely clear how true this is, but the tradition emerged that these guys, before going off on a mission to assassinate someone, would actually get all stoked up on hash. And so they were known as hashashin in connection with this, and from that we get the word assassin in English. The Fivers, the Zaydis, eventually became established in Yemen and actually founded a line of imams that would rule there until 1962. But again, the vast majority of Shiites are Jafaris or Twelvers, and you find them, they tend to be concentrated in particular areas in the Middle East. The most obvious place is Iran, where they might make up the vast majority, even if they are minority globally. But you also find large numbers in southern Lebanon and a few other places besides. But those two places are particularly important later on when we look at, for instance, the Iranian Revolution or the Lebanese Civil War. So they're basic. The reason they're called Twelvers is because they believe that the line of imams ended with the 12th imam, who didn't die, but rather went into a state of occultation or hiding, and then will return during the end days, right? And so for them, in theory, in principle at least, this 12th imam has ultimate authority with respect to all religious matters. But of course, he's not accessible. He's in this kind of state of hiding. So his will is represented by Shiite religious scholars known as mujtahideen, singular as mujtahid, who exercise what's known as ijtihad, the interpretation of religious law, right? How to actually apply it with respect to specific circumstances. So coming back to the larger narrative, we left off with the Umayyads, very unpopular caliphate or dynasty, if you will. Remember that we have this principle of dynastic succession where when the caliph dies, usually replaced by the son. And so there's kind of growing discontent throughout the empire, particularly in some regions where you have large numbers of individuals, such as in Khorasan, roughly corresponding to the eastern part of Iran, though also including parts of Afghanistan, where one day a mysterious figure known as Abu Muslim shows up looking for support for a revolution. And I don't think we can really speak of Shiites per se as constituting a sect yet. It might be better to say proto-Shiites. So they're still kind of, working out their thinking about the leadership, the idea that it should be the line of descent from Muhammad through Ali. So Abu Muslim shows up and he kind of plays off of this, indicating that he represents someone related to Muhammad. He's a bit vague about exactly the nature of that relationship. So pretty much allowing individuals to, believe whatever they want in that regard. But eventually he is able to rally support.
And so they are able to overthrow the Umayyads. And it's only at that point, after the Umayyads have been overthrown, and in fact, most of them killed, one member of the family does escape to Spain, where the Umayyad line will continue for a bit. But it's only at that point that the individual that Abu Muslim represents is revealed. It turns out that it is, in fact, somebody related to Muhammad, but not through Ali. It is someone actually descended from Muhammad's paternal uncle Al-Abbas. And this individual is the Imam, they take the title Imam, Ibrahim ibn Muhammad, fourth in the line of descent from the uncle. And hence the name of the new dynasty, the Abbasids. And pretty much at that point, they also turn on these proto-Shiites. They pretty much make a decision to adopt the kind of what's quickly emerging as kind of the mainstream form of Islam, what will eventually become Sunnism, and will in fact persecute Shiites from that point forward. So, you know, they served their purpose and then they were effectively thrown under the bus. One really important development with the Umayyads is they relocate the capital. In fact, build a new capital, a city, the proper name was Dar es Salaam, or kind of House of Peace, if you will. But within a very short period of time, it adopts the name of a nearby village known as Baghdad, hence the city of Baghdad that currently is the capital of Iraq. And so what's really important here also is that it does kind of mark a shift to the east of what might be called the cultural center of this new Islamic civilization that's emerging. And from this point forward, you're going to see growing Persian influence, right? Until now, both with respect to Islam, the religion, but also the development of this empire and so forth, the Arab people had been the dominant element. And contrary to popular belief, you know, very often you hear things about how, you know, in Islam, large numbers of people were forcibly converted and so forth. In fact, it's not only the case that that isn't true, it's really quite the opposite, particularly early on, where the Arabs would actively discourage anyone from converting. There was kind of this feeling that Islam is an Arab thing, kind of an Arab religion. And so early on, if you were a non-Arab and you wanted to convert to Islam, you really, they had this kind of whole process that you first had to become what you might call an honorary Arab, kind of a client of an Arab tribe. The term they use for these clients, the plural would be Mawla, the singular Mawali. And so, you know, eventually you then would become a Muslim, but for a while they really treated non-Arab Muslims almost as second-class kind of citizens, somehow being beneath free tribesmen. And so early on, I mean, this isn't really going to be a major problem. I mean, the numbers are pretty small for a while, but then at some point, more and more non-Arabs begin to convert. Probably Persians and Egyptians make up the bulk of that. Later on, another people, Turkic people, are going to enter the region, and so they also will adopt Islam. And as their numbers grew, they started to kind of push back on this kind of secondary status, particularly Persians who, you know, who felt very proud of their, you know, very great ancient civilization, and sometimes took kind of a dim view of the Arabs, who they saw as kind of, you know, marauding Bedouin. But in any event, Persian influence will become much more important over time. And we should note the Abbasid Caliphate, which will carry on until 1258, so beginning in 750, all right, so that's a pretty good period of time. Some would argue this is kind of a golden age for Islamic civilization. And the high point of that would be under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who, if you're familiar with the Book of 1001 Nights, or, you know, the 1001 Arabian Nights, sometimes referred to that way, he features somewhat prominently in the kind of, when they introduce a framework to that book. And definitely at this point, the Abbasid Empire is, you know, by all measures flourishing, whether economically, culturally, definitely intellectually. Baghdad becoming a very important intellectual center. Here we see territorially the extent of the Abbasid Caliphate at the time of Harun al-Rashid. So, you know, if you were going to go back in time to the 9th century, this Baghdad might be the place to go. Maybe Chang'an in China. I would definitely recommend steering clear of Europe. Speaking of which, here we have an artistic depiction of a delegation arriving from the court of Charlemagne, probably the most important ruler in Europe at this time. And this is really the beginning of the Middle or so-called Dark Ages, which, granted, some historians feel is a somewhat exaggerated term, but even by their own reckoning, there's kind of a understanding that the Abbasid Caliphate represented a much more superior civilization, something I think that is made very clear in this particular painting. Now, I mentioned that there was another people in addition to Arabs and Persians and Egyptians that are becoming very prominent in the region, and that would be the Turks, or it might be better to say Turkic people to avoid confusion with modern-day Turks who are coming from the Republic of Turkey. But that's this is how they got there. They originated in Central Asia. The term Turkic kind of reflecting a shared ethnicity, and that they all speak languages that are very closely related to one another. So that's even evident today. For instance, if you were a native Turkish speaker coming from Turkey, you could probably learn Kyrgyz or the Kazakh language pretty quickly. So they're very much connected to one another. So the Turks begin to enter Central Asia around the 10th century. And very quickly, many of them become quite prominent militarily, many entering into the military service of the Caliph, either as individuals or later on as entire tribes. So they become a very prominent element militarily, which means also a very powerful element. And many of them eventually become what are known as Mamluks, a kind of slave soldier caste, if you will. So, this isn't slavery in the sense that we understand it based on American history, for instance, right? These are individuals who convert or who, after converting to Islam, will serve. And this is, kind of the idea that they're slaves reflects their utter devotion to the Muslim caliphs, but they become an extremely powerful military caste over time. Very quickly, it's not entirely clear who is more in control of who, whether, to some degree, in theory, they're supposed to obey the caliph, but on the other hand, the caliph is increasingly under pressure to make sure that they are satisfied with whatever decisions he might make. And eventually, some of them will assert their own independence, either as military commanders who've conquered new territory, supposedly on behalf of the caliph, but then asserting their own political authority in those territories, or later on as the Abbasid Caliphate begins to fragment, you might have these Mamluk governors who are in charge of regions who just pretty much break away and kind of establish their own kingdoms. Now, they can't take the title of caliph. The title that they use is sultan. So the caliphate will continue, but increasingly it's becoming more a symbolic title, somehow reflecting the idea of Muslim unity. But where increasingly the caliph has very little political authority. And political authority starting to devolve to these various sultans, the titles that they take. And a really good example of this would be, for instance, the Seljuk Turks. Right, so the caliphate will continue, but it becomes a symbolic figure. But the real political power will lie with sultans, and related to this, we see the Abbasid Caliphate fragment into a much larger number of smaller kingdoms or sultanates. Now, in some cases, one or another sultan is able to assert their authority over much of the Middle East, so kind of maybe briefly reuniting territory under their authority. An example, again, would be the Seljuks, and here we see a map depicting the Seljuk Empire at its height. But for the most part, the region is becoming politically fragmented, and it's becoming very difficult for any one sultan to maintain authority over the entirety of that territory. Now, as it turns out, the caliph is not only losing political authority, but also any measure of religious authority he might have had early on. And at the very beginning, the caliphs would sometimes assert that they had the right to make, kind of the final call on questions related to religious belief or practice. But increasingly, that kind of authority is devolving to a group of religious authority known as the ulama. Ulama technically meaning kind of learned men, the idea that they are learned first and foremost in the Quran and in the faith, but also with respect to, the laws of nature, philosophical issues, and so forth. But these individuals ultimately come to have religious authority. And it is important to know in Islam, particularly if we're talking about the mainstream Sunni Islam, there is no ultimate authority, a kind of pope figure like you might find in the Catholic Church. So there is no one single member of the ulama who somehow has the final word on any particular issue, meaning different members of the ulama might actually come up with contradictory rulings and so forth. This, by the way, becomes very important in the modern period when, sometimes you see that a member of the ulama somewhere issued a fatwa or ruling, and so it might be presented in the media somehow reflecting the mindset of all Muslims. Really nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, in most cases, that really just reflects one individual's opinion, and depending on how important a member they are, how well respected they are, it might be of almost zero consequence. In any event, though, I mean, before we get to the modern period, the ulama also become very important in administering society at the local level. And this would have been done on the basis of Sharia or Islamic law. Again, a very misunderstood concept. Sharia covers an incredibly vast array of laws, interpretations, and commentary, and there's no like very kind of narrow definition of Sharia that such as is often suggested in the media. I should point out too that there are no modern states, with the possible exceptions of Saudi Arabia and Iran, that actually have a legal system entirely based on Sharia. It might be like one factor influencing law alongside many other influences, some coming from Europe and so forth. But the idea that the vast majority of Muslims live under Sharia today is definitely not true. But back in the pre-modern period, Sharia did matter. But there was tremendous flexibility in that regard, and there was scope for legal rulings outside of Sharia. Probably the most important member of the ulama in any given community would have been the judge of the Islamic court, the qadi. So just to give you a basic idea about the role of the ulama in pre-modern Muslim majority societies. And we're coming pretty close to wrapping up this particular lecture. We should note that during this period of political fragmentation, and we're kind of leading up to the Crusades, so we're talking about kind of roughly the 10th, 11th centuries, there would even be, in a few cases, Shiite dynasties being established. Many of them proved short-lived, and very often the ruling dynasty would do very little by way of trying to convert subject populations to Shiism, so it didn't have a very long-term effect. But sometimes they did play a pretty important role in terms of historical developments. And so one we should note is the Fatimid dynasty, and they belong to the Sevener Shi'i sect. So they kind of coexisted with the Seljuks, but would establish their empire in North Africa. So they started in North Africa, eventually brought Egypt under their control, which they then made kind of the center of their empire, founding a new capital, El-Qahra, known in English as Cairo. And so they were Seveners. They claimed descent through Hussein, but also from Fatima. They really kind of emphasized their relationship to her, and hence the name the Fatimid dynasty, right? Named after the daughter of Muhammad. And here we see the, territorially, the Fatimid Empire at its greatest extent. And it had, again, started in North Africa, but eventually really kind of based itself in what today is modern-day Egypt, around their new capital of El-Qahra, or Cairo. And I just want to mention one last thing. As with the other Shiite dynasties, which were, that I mentioned briefly, we're not going to really discuss them in any any detail, but very little attempt made at like somehow forcibly converting the population to Shiism. And so by the time the Fatimid Empire comes to an end, the vast majority of Muslims in Egypt will remain Sunni. So that brings us to the Crusades. And on the eve of the Crusades, the Middle East pretty much divided up between three sizable empires. We have in orange the Byzantine Empire, what remains of that. In green, the Seljuks. So I should note, right when we're coming up on the Crusades, had already started to politically fragment into a larger number of smaller sultanates. And then finally, we have the Fatimid Empire, roughly in the area corresponding to modern-day Egypt. And so that's kind of setting the scene. And I want to mention one last thing before we end this particular lecture, kind of setting things up for the next one in the sequence. It might surprise people to know that even as of this point, right, and this is, hundreds of years after Islam began, but the vast majority of people in the Middle East are still not Muslim. We mentioned earlier about, this idea of people being forcibly converted, greatly exaggerated. And that is certainly borne out by the fact that even at this point, still huge numbers of non-Muslim subjects, right? So kind of really drawn out gradual process of Islamization in terms of what people believe. So we'll stop there, and, I'll see you in the next lecture.